The morning Carl Bergstrom appeared in her doorway, hat pressed flat against his chest. Marta Lund did not speak. She had been awake since before dawn, the way she had been awake most mornings since August, lying still in the dark and listening to the cabin walls breathe against the cold. She watched him stand there in the gray January light, this man who had told her she was digging her own grave, and she felt nothing that resembled triumph. What she felt was older and quieter than that. She stepped back from the door and let the story find its ending. But that was January. This was August, and the ending had not yet been written, and Marta Lund had $43 folded into my leather pouch sewn into the lining of her dress, and 2 mules that needed water, and 160 acres of Dakota prairie that had already broken younger people than her. The land office in Yankton County smelled of pipe smoke and damp wood and the particular anxiety of people making decisions they could not take back. The clerk behind the counter was a young man with ink on his fingers and the careful expression of someone trained not to show surprise. He showed surprise anyway. He looked at Marta once when she pushed the papers across the counter, and then he looked again slower, taking in the details. The way a man catalogs something he expects to describe later, her age, which she had passed 62 the previous March. Her hands, which were not the soft hands of a woman who had spent her life indoors. The fact that she was alone, entirely alone, with no husband beside her, and no son standing behind her, and no neighbor vouching for her steadiness. She signed her name and slid the papers back. He stamped them without further comment. Outside, the August heat pressed down on Yankton like a wet cloth, and her mules stood at the post with the patient exhaustion of animals that had traveled far and expected to travel farther. The claim was 12 miles north and slightly west, following a creek bed that the locals called Beaver Creek, though the beavers had been gone for years. The previous owners, 3 separate sets of them, according to the land office records, had each lasted less than 2 seasons. The first had planted a kitchen garden and then abandoned it when the well came up brackish. The second had started a cabin and then abandoned that when the husband broke his leg in October and could not face a Dakota winter with one working limb. The third had been her husband. Thomas Lund had come to Dakota Territory in the spring of 1887 with a plan that was better than most and worse than the territory. He had come with seeds and tools and the practical optimism of a man who had farmed Minnesota for 20 years and believed that competence transferred between climates. He had cut the first cottonwood logs for the cabin in late May. By June, he had 4 walls standing and a partial roof framed and a hole 3 feet deep beneath what would become the kitchen floor. By the middle of June, he had a fever that climbed to 104 and refused to come down, and by the last week of June, he was buried on a small rise above the creek where the ground was soft enough to dig. The neighbors who came for the burial were practical people who had seen the territory take other settlers and had developed a kind of efficient sympathy for the survivors. They offered to buy Marta a train ticket back to Minnesota. Several of them assumed she would take it. She thanked them and loaded her wagon. She understood what the refusal meant. A woman past 60 alone on the Dakota prairie in August had somewhere between 3 and 4 months before the first hard freeze made everything she had not yet accomplished irreversible. The cabin needed a floor, a proper roof, and chinking between every log. She needed 8 cords of wood split and stacked before October. She needed to harvest whatever Thomas had planted before the frost took it. And she needed a root cellar, a proper root cellar, not the 3-foot scratch in the earth her husband had started before the fever found him. It was this last item that Marta thought about on the 12-mile ride north from Yankton, with the August sun burning the back of her neck and the creek glittering through the grass to her left. She thought about it with the specific, unpleasant focus of a woman doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. 3 feet was the standard depth. Every cellar she had seen in Minnesota, every cellar she had seen in the settlements along the Missouri, every cellar that Carl Bergstrom and the other established homesteaders of Beaver Creek had dug, they all went 3 feet into the earth and stopped there, because 3 feet was where the common wisdom stopped, and nobody had yet felt the need to push further. Marta had felt that need for 14 years. She had felt it first on a morning in January of 1873 in a farmstead outside of Red Wing, Minnesota, when she was 19 years old, and her father opened the door of their root cellar and stood very still for a long moment before she understood from the stillness what he had found inside. Her brother Eric had been 9 years old. He had been hungry in the night. They were all hungry that winter. The kind of hungry that makes children wake at 2 in the morning and lie in the dark thinking about food, and he had crept out of the house and down into the cellar looking for something to eat. The cellar was 3 feet deep. That winter, the frost had gone 4. The potatoes had frozen solid in their bins. The carrots had split. Everything the family had stored for winter had turned to ice and rot in a single night, and Eric had been inside when the temperature dropped and he had not come back out. Marta had been the one to find him. She remembered the smell. Pershars frozen earth has a different smell than merely cold earth, something mineral and final, nothing like the ordinary cold of a winter morning. She remembered her father lifting Eric out and how her father carried him to the house without speaking, and how he set the boy down on the table and stood with his hands at his sides and said with no particular expression, "I didn't dig deep enough." That sentence had traveled with Marta for 14 years. It had been present at her wedding to Thomas and at the births of her children, both of whom had grown and moved east, and at Thomas's burial on the rise above Beaver Creek. And it was present now as she guided the mules north through the August heat toward a claim that needed a cellar. 3 feet was not deep enough. She had known this since she was 19. The question was, how deep was deep enough? And the answer to that question required knowing something that most people had never needed to know and had no particular reason to learn. Frost depth is not a fixed number. It moves with the winter, deepening during sustained cold snaps and retreating during mild spells. And its behavior varies significantly with snow-cover soil composition and the specific character of a given season. In an ordinary bad winter in Dakota Territory, the frost line might reach 4 feet in exposed locations with thin snow cover. In an extraordinary winter, the kind that came once in a generation, the kind that nobody still living in Beaver Creek had ever actually experienced, the frost line could go considerably deeper. Marta did not know exactly how deep. She knew that 3 feet was what her father had dug, and that 3 feet had not been enough. She had been thinking about this problem in a loose background way for years, the way you think about a door. Eventually needs fixing, and it had sharpened into something more focused during the long wagon ride from Red Wing, Minnesota, where she had spent the last 14 years, to Yankton County, where she intended to spend the remainder of her life. She had spent the journey doing calculations in her head, returning to the same figures the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. Earth at 15 feet maintained a temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. She had read this in an agricultural pamphlet left in a hotel lobby in Sioux Falls, and she had read it several times to be certain she was reading it correctly. 50 degrees was too warm for long-term potato storage. Potatoes needed to be kept between 38 and 40 degrees in order to remain firm and edible through a full winter. But 50 degrees was a starting point, not an ending point. With a properly designed ventilation system, she could bring the temperature down to the required range by allowing cold air to sink in through carefully placed pipes during cold nights, and then sealing the cellar during the day to hold what the night had given. This was not a guess. This was physics. Cold air is denser than warm air and sinks when given the opportunity. The Earth at depth is an enormous thermal mass that changes temperature slowly. The combination of the two controlled nighttime ventilation and deep Earth insulation could produce a chamber that maintained 38 to 40 degrees even during a winter that sent surface temperatures to 30 or 40 below zero. What Marta needed was the depth, 15 feet, and she needed it finished before the ground froze in October, which gave her approximately 6 weeks. The cabin came into view around a bend in the creek. Thomas's 4 walls of cottonwood log, standing on a low-rise, roofless in the middle sections where the framing had not been finished, the whole structure draped in canvas that flapped and cracked in the afternoon wind like something impatient. The mules slowed without being told. Marta sat in the wagon and looked at what her husband had built and what it would cost her to finish it. And she performed the calculation she would perform many times in the weeks ahead, time against necessity, each need competing with every other need, each hour spent on one thing being an hour taken from something else. She climbed down, watered the mules, and walked to the 3-foot hole beneath the kitchen frame. She lowered a length of rope into it and measured the depth against her arm. 3 feet, same as her father's cellar, same as every cellar in Beaver Creek. She coiled the rope slowly, feeling the weight of what she was about to decide, and then she walked to the corner of the cabin where Thomas had left his tools, and she picked up the long-handled spade and drove it into the earth at the edge of the hole. The settlement at Beaver Creek had grown fast since the land rush began in 1879. It filled with families from across the Midwest and the Upper Plains states from Wisconsin and Ohio and Illinois people who brought practical farming knowledge and the particular stubbornness of those who had already relocated once and did not intend to do it again. Most had arrived during the boom years when the weather cooperated and the harvests were reasonable, and the worst thing about Dakota Territory was the isolation and the wind. Most had never seen what the prairie became when it decided to remind settlers who was in charge. Carl Bergstrom had been in Dakota Territory for 9 years. He had come in 1878, a year before the main rush, which gave him a certain authority among the settlers. Not official authority, nothing written down, but the kind of authority that accrues to a man who has survived something others have not, and who is known to have survived it. He had survived the winter of 1881, which had buried fence posts entirely and held temperatures at 38 below zero for 11 consecutive days. He had buried his wife that winter and his son the following winter, and he had emerged from these experiences with a settled certainty about what the territory required of its inhabitants, a certainty so complete that it had stopped being an opinion and become something more like a fact about the world. Marta encountered him for the first time outside the general store in Beaver Creek, a building constructed of sod on 3 sides with a wooden false front facing the road, which gave it an expression of civic optimism that the structure itself did not quite support. She had driven in from the claim on a Thursday morning to buy supplies and to ask questions of people who knew the territory, and Carl Bergstrom was standing in front of the store talking to 2 other men when she tied up the mules and went inside. He was waiting when she came out. Not waiting specifically for her, he had simply remained while the other men drifted away, and the result was the same. He was a tall man, still broad through the shoulders at 63, with the careful economy of movement that comes from spending years in environments where careless motion has consequences. His face had the weathered quality of someone who had spent a long time outdoors in difficult weather, not unpleasant but settled like a landscape that has long since stopped changing. He introduced himself and offered to answer questions about the territory, which was neighborly and useful, and Marta asked him the questions that were most pressing on her mind, which were not the questions he expected. She asked about cellar depth. His answer came with the unhurried confidence of a man delivering established fact. 3 feet is what we dig. 3 feet keeps your potatoes. The snow insulates, the earth holds. A properly banked cellar with good sod coverage will see your stores through any reasonable winter. The frost went to 4 feet in Minnesota in 1873, Marta said. I was there. His expression shifted slightly. Not dismissal, something more, considered the face of a man recalibrating a small detail. This is not Minnesota. The Dakota winters run cold, but the snowpack here is generally better. Snow insulates. 3 feet has held for 9 years in this settlement. And if it goes deeper than 3 feet, Carl Bergstrom looked at her the way experienced people sometimes look at newcomers who ask questions that reveal a fundamental misunderstanding, not unkindly but with a certain patience. Then God has made a decision about your survival. But a frost that goes below 3 feet of well-banked earth is a 100-year event. You planning to dig for a 100-year winter? He paused, and something in his expression shifted toward what might have been genuine concern. You have more pressing matters. That cabin needs a real roof before October. You need 8 cords of wood stacked and your chinking done before the first hard freeze. A woman alone cannot afford to waste weeks on a hole when the tasks that will definitely keep you alive are waiting undone. He said the word alone without particular emphasis, but it landed with the weight of everything he meant by it. Marta heard it and filed it where she kept things she would deal with later. How much would a deeper cellar cost in timber? She asked. He told her, more than she could afford, more labor than she could provide, more time than she had before the ground hardened. He was correct on all 3 counts, and she knew he was correct, and she thanked him for his time and drove back to the claim and spent the evening doing calculations by lamplight that confirmed everything he had said and changed nothing about what she intended to do. The harvest came in the last week of September, better than she had dared to calculate. Thomas had planted potatoes and turnips on the south-facing slope before the fever took him, and they had grown without him in the manner of things that do not require permission. Marta had added rows of carrots and cabbage through the summer, working in the early mornings before the heat built, and in the evenings when the light went long and orange across the grass. She spent 2 full days harvesting, counting each bushel with the attention of someone who understands that numbers have consequences. 12 bushels of potatoes, 8 of turnips, 6 of carrots pulled cleanly from soil that released them without cracking, 3 of cabbage, 37 jars of preserved wild plums put up from the thickets along the creek bank, the plums small and tart and requiring more sugar than she had, so she had rationed the sugar, and the result was a preserve that was more tart than sweet, but would not go to rot before February. She stacked everything in the shade of the cabin's north wall and looked at it for a long time, enough to survive the winter if none of it spoiled, if the cellar held, if the frost stayed where frost was supposed to stay. She went back to digging. The first 4 feet had gone quickly the way the beginning of any hard task goes quickly when the body is still fresh and the end is not yet visible. Prairie topsoil was loose from the summer rains, and she could move 2 inches of depth per hour if she paced herself and rested when the burning in her shoulders crossed from discomfort into warning. But at 4 feet, the soil changed character entirely. The subsoil was dense packed clay, the kind that had been compressed by centuries of prairie grass, in winter and spring flooding into something closer to soft stone than earth. Each stroke of the shovel sent a shock up through her palms and wrists and elbows. She slowed to 1 inch of depth per hour, some hours less. She fashioned a rope and bucket system using a cottonwood post she braced across the mouth of the hole, hauling the loosened clay up in a canvas sling she had sewn from a feed bag. The mound of excavated earth grew on the south side of the hole. The hole grew more slowly. Her blisters broke and healed and broke again. Ruth Pedersen appeared on the third day of digging. Ruth was 42 years old with 6 children and the kind of face that had moved past worrying about what it looked like and arrived at something more useful, direct, and evaluating missing very little. She stood at the edge of the expanding pit and watched Marta work without speaking for a full minute before she said anything. Marta climbed out when she heard the footsteps wiping clay from her hands onto her apron. Ruth was already peering into the hole with the expression of someone doing involuntary arithmetic. "What are you doing?" Ruth's voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a practical woman asking a practical question. "Digging a cellar." "That is not a cellar." Ruth pointed into the hole. "You're past 5 feet. Nobody digs 5 feet. I'm going to 15. Ruth's face went through several distinct stages. Surprise, then a rapid recalculation, then something that arrived at concern and settled there. "Marta, that's madness. The walls will collapse if we get a wet October. And when you're down there in January getting potatoes and the rungs are iced over, you'll break your neck on the way out." The frost went 4 feet in Minnesota in 1873. Marta picked up the shovel. "This is not Minnesota, I know that. But the frost doesn't know that either." Ruth stood watching for a moment with the posture of someone who wants to say more and is deciding whether it will be received. When she spoke again, something had changed in her voice, the edge of argument replaced by something more like honest worry. "You're going to miss the window for your roof. You're going to miss the time for your wood and your chinking. The ground freezes in 6 weeks. You cannot do everything." "Then I'll do this first." Why Marta drove the shovel into the clay. "Because the roof won't matter if I starve." She said it without heat, without drama. The way she might have stated that water runs downhill as fact as conclusion, as the end of a calculation that had been running in her head for 14 years. Ruth left without further argument. Marta watched her go and then went back down into the hole. The hole reached 6 feet on the 5th day. At 6 feet, the temperature changed. She noticed it first in the mornings when she climbed down the ladder, for the sun was fully up. The air at the bottom of the pit was cooler than the air above, not cold, not yet, but different in the way that a spring house is different from a warm room. There was a stillness to it, a dampness that the surface air did not have. She pressed her palm flat against the clay wall and held it there. The wall was cool and steady and did not vary the way a shadow varies when a cloud passes. It held its temperature with the indifference of something that had not noticed the surface world in a very long time. This was what she had been digging toward. Not just the depth, but this quality of steadiness. The earth at depth did not know what season it was. That was the point. That was the entire point. At 8 feet, the soil changed again. The clay gave way to something denser and darker, almost silty, the kind of soil laid down in slow water over long time. It was harder to work than the clay above, but the walls held their shape better. She stopped needing to worry about a rain softening the walls into collapse. The pit had stopped being a hole and started being a chamber. She was 9 feet down on a Sunday morning when she heard footsteps on the path from the east road. Not Ruth's quick, purposeful stride, not the measured walk of Carl Bergstrom, but something lighter and uneven, the walk of someone who had covered a long distance and was not entirely sure of the welcome waiting at the end of it. Owen Farley was 17 years old and looked thin in the way young men are thin before the full work of living has filled them out with the raw hands of someone who had been doing farm labor since he was old enough to hold a tool and the steady eyes of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by difficulty. He was leading a mule that looked nearly as tired as he did, and he stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down into it for a long moment before he looked at Marta. "I heard you're digging deep." His voice was even, neither skeptical nor impressed, just taking in information. Marta climbed the ladder. She was 8 feet below the surface, and the climb left her winded in a way it had not at the beginning, her arms carrying the accumulated exhaustion of 9 days of hard digging. She stood at the rim and looked at the boy. His hands were calloused in the right places. His eyes did not slide away from hers. "Mrs. Pedersen tell you that she said you were trying to dig to China and you'd kill yourself doing it." He glanced into the pit again, estimating, "That's deeper than any cellar I've seen. It needs to be deeper." He waited, not impatiently, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that asking too quickly sometimes means you don't hear the real answer. Marta looked at him for a moment and made a decision. She told him about Eric. Not the whole story at once, not the way you tell a story when you are performing it, but the way you explain something to someone who needs to understand a decision you have made. She told him about the Minnesota winter of 1873 in the 3-foot cellar and the frost that went 4 feet and the morning her father found her brother inside. She told him about the potatoes frozen black in their skins and the carrots split open by the cold, and the way everything they had stored to carry them through winter had been destroyed in a single night. She told him about the arithmetic 38 to 40 degrees was the window, that narrow corridor between frozen and sprouted, and every foot of depth was a degree of security, a margin between eating and starving. Owen listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the ground between his feet. "Then my father dug a 3-foot cellar." His voice had no particular emotion in it, just the flat delivery of a fact that had been sitting with him for a while. "Last winter we lost half our potatoes to frost. He called it bad luck." He paused. "I thought it was bad planning." Something shifted in Marta's chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition. The particular sensation of being understood by someone you did not expect to understand you. "How much deeper are you going?" Owen looked up at her. 15 feet total. He nodded once, slowly working through the math. "You'll need timber to shore the walls." "I don't have money for timber." Another pause, longer this time. He was looking at something past the pit toward the south field, and Marta had the impression he was not looking at the field at all, but at something inside his own thinking. Then, "My father had some lumber put by before he died. Oak posts and pine planking. It's at the old place, just sitting. Nobody's using it." "What do you want for it?" He turned back to her. "A place to sleep through winter. A share of whatever that cellar keeps." Marta looked at him steadily. He did not look away. She had been alone on this claim for 6 weeks, and she had carried every decision alone, and every bucket of clay alone, and the weight of Eric alone for 14 years, and here was a 17-year-old boy offering his dead father's lumber in exchange for shelter and food. And the frontier did not deal in sentiment. It dealt in math, and the math was plain. But she wanted to understand the boy before she agreed. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "After your mother took the others back to Wisconsin." He took a breath that was not quite a sigh. His father had filed a land claim before the pneumonia took him a quarter section adjacent to Marta's claim to the East Good Soil Creek access. The claim would expire unclaimed in 2 years. Owen had stayed to work and save enough to file it officially to pay the fees and buy seed and tools to do in 2 years what his father had not lived to do. He was not quite there yet. He was closer than he had been in the spring. "You came here because Ruth Pedersen told you I was going to kill myself," Marta said. "She said you were digging something no one understood and you were about to fail." He met her eyes. I came because I wanted to see if you were right about the depth, because if you're right, I need to know it before I build my own cellar. Marta held out her hand. He shook it. They went back to digging. The lumber arrived 3 days later, Owen leading the mule cart up the track from the east with the boards stacked crosswise and the oak posts tied alongside. 6 posts of rough-cut oak, each between 9 and 10 feet shorter than the 12-foot posts Marta had originally calculated, and 4 fewer than the 8 she had specified. She stood beside the cart and did the arithmetic without speaking. Owen watched her face. Not enough. Not as specified. She walked the length of the cart, running her hand along the posts. The oak is good, solid grain, no rot. She stopped at the end and looked back at the hole, now 10 feet deep, the clay walls holding cleanly in the dry October air. We redesign. Instead of a 15-foot square, we go 12 by 12. 4 corner posts plus 4 midpoints on each wall. The oak at the corners, cottonwood from the creek at the midpoints, larger diameter to compensate for the softer wood. We sink them 2 feet into the floor instead of 1 to give extra hold. Owen considered this. Will it hold the roof weight? If we cut the cottonwood right and brace the midpoints with cross beams at 4-foot intervals, the roof won't span more than 12 feet at any point. She looked at him. Can you cut cottonwood? I've been cutting cottonwood since I was 12. Then we have what we need. They reached 10 feet on the 14th day. At 10 feet, the air at the bottom of the pit was markedly different from the air above, still damp, carrying the mineral taste of deep earth. Owen climbed down one afternoon to help set a brace and stood at the bottom for a moment with his head slightly lifted, the way an animal orients itself in a new space. Feels like being inside something, he said, like the ground swallowed us. That's the point. Marta pressed her hand to the wall. Up there, it can be 60 degrees or minus 40. Down here, the earth doesn't know what month it is. 50 degrees year-round without any management. 50 degrees won't keep potatoes. No, that's what the ventilation is for. She pointed upward toward where the roof would be. 2 pipes through the roof, one near the entrance, one at the far corner. At night, when the air above drops below 40 degrees, we open both. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. We let it fill the chamber. At dawn, we close the pipes and seal the heat. The earth holds temperature the way a crock holds water, slowly in, slowly out. She looked at him. It will take 3 or 4 days of cycling to bring the chamber down to 38. Once it's there, the earth does the work. Owen nodded, working through it. My father never thought about any of that. He just dug and hoped. Hope is not a plan. She said it without looking at him, driving the shovel into the floor of the pit. It was simply true, the way most important things are simply true. They reached 15 feet on October 29th. Marta stood at the bottom and looked up at the circle of gray sky above her, small and distant, a coin of light at the top of a shaft that had taken her 23 days to dig. The floor of the cellar was so far below the surface that even at midday the sun cast no direct light on it. The temperature at the bottom held steady at 52 degrees, even as the surface temperatures had begun dropping toward freezing at night. The framing went up over the following 5 days. The oak corner posts went in, first sunk 2 feet into the floor, with the base stones Thomas had cut for the cabin foundation and never used. Cottonwood midpoints followed their larger diameter, making up in mass what they lacked in density. Cross beams of rough-cut oak spanned between the posts at 4-foot intervals, creating a skeleton that Marta tested by pushing her full weight against each joint before moving to the next. The roof was the piece that kept her awake. Too light and the banking soil would collapse it. Too heavy and the posts would shift. She and Owen argued it out in the evenings over weak coffee and the remains of a salt pork that was getting toward the end of its usefulness, and arrived at a compromise: double-layer cottonwood planks, then 12 inches of prairie sod, then another layer of planks, then more sod on top. The finished roof weighed somewhere over 1,000 pounds by Marta's estimate. It sagged 4 inches at the center. She studied the sag for an entire morning before concluding that the post would hold it, and that 4 inches of sag in the center was not failure but settlement, the structure finding its own equilibrium. The door was a trap door cut into the roof frame, hinged with leather straps cut from an old harness that Thomas had left in the toolbox. The ladder was cottonwood rungs mortised into 2 upright rails, not elegant, functional, built to be climbed with numb hands, carrying a bushel of potatoes in the dark of January. Marta descended and ascended it 20 times on the day she finished, it counting the rungs, testing each one. The cellar was finished and sealed on the 15th of November. That same week, Hank Storrow came by the property without announcement, his manner as before, and stood at the closed trap door, looking at it for a moment before he looked at Marta, who was at the woodpile. He was a large man with the deliberate movement of someone who had learned to make his size useful rather than awkward, and he carried the expression of a man who had expected to be unimpressed and was revising that expectation against his will. He asked to go down. Marta opened the trap door and let him. He was in the cellar for a considerable time. When he came back up, his face had the particular stillness of a man updating a calculation he had thought was finished. 40 degrees. He closed the trap door behind him. How did you bring it down from 52? Marta explained the ventilation system, the pipes, the timing, the way cold air sank and filled the chamber each night while the earth absorbed and held it through the day. She used no more words than the explanation required. Storrow listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to understand a mechanism rather than looking for the flaw in it. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved from the cellar to the cabin. Its new roof of cottonwood planks and sod, not elegant but solid, then to the woodpile which held 5 cords, where 8 would have been the minimum for a comfortable winter. He had not softened toward her situation. He was performing the same cold audit he performed on every undertaking he encountered. You know the ground freezes in 10 days. You haven't got your wood stacked. You're 2 months behind on everything except that hole. The hole will keep us alive. The hole will be useless if you freeze in a cabin with no roof. He paused. You have 5 cords. 8 is minimum. 5 gets us to January. In January, we cut more. Storrow looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man watching someone do something he cannot quite categorize as brave or reckless, because in this particular case, the distinction may not exist. The math doesn't work, he said. I've been doing it since I wrote up. One of those things is going to fail. Maybe all of them. Marta looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had found her brother in a frozen cellar at 19 years old and had spent 14 years doing the math that would have prevented it. Then I will fail above the ground, she said, not below it. Storrow stared at her. Something moved in his expression, not admiration, not quite that, but something in its neighborhood, something that involved recognition. He turned and walked back to his horse without another word. That night, the first frost came. Marta stood in the cabin doorway and watched it paint the grass white in the moonlight, this first assertion of what was coming. The air had that particular stillness that precedes hard cold, a held breath quality. She looked at her 15-foot hole in the ground with its new roof and its leather-hinged trapdoor and its 2 wooden ventilation pipes, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not certainty. She was too old for certainty, but a calm, particular readiness, the readiness of someone who has done the work that could be done and is now prepared to see what it was worth. She went inside and added a log to the fire and did not sleep for a long time. They hit 15 feet on the 29th of October, and the number felt different from the inside than it had from above. Standing at the bottom of the shaft with a lantern in one hand and a plumb line in the other, Marta looked up at the rectangle of pale sky that was all that remained of the surface world, and the distance seemed both greater and more necessary than she had imagined during all the weeks of digging toward it. Owen stood beside her, his breath visible in the still air of the chamber. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The earth pressed close on all 4 sides with the indifferent patience of something that had been waiting here long before either of them arrived and would continue waiting long after. The ventilation pipes were the first thing Marta addressed after the framing was complete. 2 pipes each bored through the roof with a hand auger Owen had brought from his father's tools, one positioned near the trapdoor entrance, one at the far diagonal corner. She fitted each with a wooden sleeve that could be opened or closed by a sliding panel controlled from below with a cord. The design was simple enough that she had drawn it out on the back of a flour sack 2 weeks earlier, and the execution matched the drawing closely enough to satisfy her, though the bore through the second pipe ran slightly off plumb and required shimming with strips of rawhide to seal cleanly when closed. She borrowed a thermometer from the schoolteacher in Beaver Creek, a small mercury instrument, in a brass casing that the teacher parted with, reluctantly extracting a promise that it would be returned before the first week of December when the school held its winter examination. Marta climbed down the ladder with the thermometer and held it at arm's length in the center of the chamber and waited. The mercury settled at 52 degrees. Too warm. She had known it would be too warm. The Earth at this depth ran 50 to 55 without intervention, and the goal was 38 to 40, and the distance between those numbers was the entire purpose of the ventilation system she had just finished building. That night, she opened both pipes at dusk and left them open until the sky began to lighten in the east. The following morning, she descended and read the thermometer. 46 degrees. Better. She opened the pipes again the next night and sealed them at dawn. By the fourth morning, the mercury read 41 degrees, and by the fifth it held at 39, even after a full day of the pipes being sealed, while the October sun, weak as it was worked at the sod roof above. Owen stood on the ladder with his head at floor level, watching her read the thermometer. 39, Marta looked at the mercury. 39 degrees, 41 at the perimeter near the walls. She turned slowly in the chamber, pressing her palm to each wall in turn. The clay was cool and faintly damp and utterly steady. The walls are holding it. The earth is holding what the night air gave us. Owen was quiet for a moment. Will it stay there through January? She looked at him levelly. We'll know in January. The storing took 2 full days. They lowered the potato bins, first slatted wooden crates that Owen had built from scrap pine, each one set on wooden pallets to keep the potatoes off the floor and away from any ground moisture that might wick up through the clay. Marta inspected each potato before it went into the bin, turning it in her hands, pressing her thumb gently against the skin to check for soft spots, setting aside anything that showed the beginning of rot. She culled 11 potatoes from the 12 bushels of small loss clean work. The turnips went against the east wall in their own bins, separated from the potatoes by 3 feet of airspace, because root vegetables stored together exchange moisture in ways that accelerate spoilage. This was knowledge her mother had carried from her own mother, practical and specific, and not written down anywhere. That Marta knew of the kind of knowledge that lived in hands and passed between women across generations without fanfare. The carrots went into wooden boxes packed with dry straw, oriented with the root ends down to slow the natural process by which carrots sent their energy back toward an absent soil. The cabbages Owen hung from the ceiling, joists on lengths of cord, their outer leaves still intact to protect the heads, spaced so none touched another. The preserved plums in their 37 jars went on a shelf along the southwest wall, away from the vegetables and away from the ventilation pipes that brought the coldest air into the northeast corner of the chamber. Owen set the last crate down and stood back and looked at the full cellar for the first time. The lantern threw warm light across the rows of potato bins and the hanging cabbages and the jars of dark preserves, and the chamber smelled of earth and root vegetables, and something underneath both of those things, something older and quieter, the smell of depth itself. My father's cellar, he said slowly, working something out. I remember going down there as a kid. It smelled like mud and rot by February, like the whole thing was slowly going bad. He looked around the chamber. This smells like it's going to last. Marta latched the trap door above them and checked the cord on each ventilation pipe. Both sealed, both tight. The thermometer read 38 degrees. The potatoes were firm in their bins. The cabbages hung motionless on their cords. And the stillness of the chamber was the stillness of something preserved, something held at exactly the right temperature between 2 kinds of ruin. She climbed the ladder and stood in the cold November air and allowed herself a single long breath of something that was not quite relief. Relief implied that the danger had passed, and the danger had not passed. The danger was in fact just beginning to organize itself several hundred miles to the northwest, though she did not yet know this and would not know it for another 6 weeks. The cabin roof went up in the week before Thanksgiving. The canvas that had been serving as temporary covering since August came down in sections, rolled and stored against the south wall of the cabin for later use. Cottonwood planks went up in their place, laid perpendicular to the rafters, and spiked down with the last of Thomas's iron nails, then covered with a layer of prairie sod, cut from the slope north of the cabin where the grass had deep roots that held the soil together in workable sections. The sod went down in overlapping rows like shingles, the root side up, and by the time the last row was laid and tamped, the cabin had stopped being a temporary structure and become something that intended to be there in the spring. The walls needed another week. Marta worked from the outside, pushing dried grass and shredded moss into every gap between the cottonwood logs, while Owen followed from the inside, pressing clay into the spaces from his side until the two materials met somewhere in the middle of each joint, and the cold that had been leaking freely through the walls slowed to an occasional breath. They banked earth 3 feet high against the outside walls on the north and west, faces the directions from which Dakota wind arrived on, with the most conviction packing it firm and covering it with more sod to hold it through the freeze. The wood situation did not improve. 5 cords was what they had, and 5 cords was what they kept, because the week of roofing and chinking consumed every hour of daylight they had, and then the first hard cold arrived in the second week of November and froze the ground to 8 inches and made the cutting and splitting of new wood substantially more difficult than it would have been in October. Marta calculated the burn rate against the supply every evening, adjusting the target temperature inside the cabin by 1 degree when the calculation required it. 62 degrees, 60, 58. 58 was cold enough that breath occasionally showed in the early morning, but it was survivable, and survival was the metric she was using. December was cold, but within the range of what the territory considered ordinary. The temperature dropped to 12 below on Christmas Eve and held near 0 for the first week of January. Marta descended to the cellar every morning before breakfast, read the thermometer, and climbed back up. 38, 39. Once after a mild night 42, which resolved back to 39 by the following morning, when she opened the ventilation pipes for 2 hours before dawn. The potatoes remained firm in their bins. The carrots packed in their straw showed no sign of the limpness that preceded rot. The cabbages hung from their cords unchanged, as though time were not passing at all in the chamber below. In the other cellars of Beaver Creek, the news was less steady. Ruth Pedersen sent word through a neighbor's boy that her cellar floor had frozen in the second week of January. Not the bins, the floor itself. Solid clay that had turned to ice from the bottom up, and the cold had crept into the lowest bin and taken 2 bushels of potatoes before she noticed. Walter Den found ice crystals forming on his turnips and moved everything to the highest shelves and spent 3 days anxious about whether the shelves would be enough. Carl Bergstrom, who checked his own cellar with the systematic confidence of a man whose methods had been validated by 9 years of success, found that the cold had reached 18 inches into his potato supply and was still moving. The settlement talked. In the way that small settlements talk when something is going wrong more broadly than any individual failure can account for, not panic, not yet, but the low, steady hum of people comparing notes and arriving at a consensus that this winter was running colder than the last several, that the frost line was lower than it should be, that the margins they had calculated in August were tighter than they had felt in October. The morning of January 12th arrived without distinction. The temperature at dawn was 34 degrees above 0 warm, for January notably warm, the kind of warmth that made people in the settlement step outside without their heaviest coats and remark to each other that perhaps the worst had already passed. Children went to school without the full layering their parents usually insisted on. Farmers walked to their barns in lighter boots. The sky was pale and clear, and the sun gave actual light if not actual warmth, and the whole prairie had the quality of a held breath that no one recognized as a held breath. Marta recognized it. She had been awake before dawn, which was not unusual, but this particular wakefulness had a different quality, not the ordinary insomnia of cold nights and insufficient firewood, but a heightened attention, a physical alertness that she could not immediately account for. She dressed and went outside before the sun was fully up and stood in the yard and looked at the sky. The sky was wrong. Not wrong in any way that could be easily described to someone who had not felt it before. The color was ordinary. The clouds were ordinary. The wind was the ordinary light wind of a January morning. But the pressure was wrong. The air had a softness to it, a strange mildness, that her body recognized as a warning before her mind caught up to what her body knew. Her father had called it a weather breeder. The old-timers had a phrase for it, the wolf's smile. The warmth before the killing, cold the sky opening wide and generous, right before it closed on everything underneath it. She had last felt this quality of air in Minnesota in January of 1873, the morning before the storm that froze Eric's cellar and took her brother and changed the course of her life. She went to the cellar first. 38 degrees. She checked both ventilation pipes, sealed cord-taut wooden panels flush, She laid 2 flat stones across the trapdoor for additional weight against wind uplift and latched the iron hook she had mounted on the doorframe specifically for this purpose. Then she went to the cabin and told Owen to bring the mules inside. Inside, he stared at her. They won't fit. She was already moving toward the water barrel. Every pot and bucket filled with water now. The mules first, then the water. Owen looked at the pale, mild, entirely ordinary-seeming January sky one more time, with the expression of someone wanting to find a reason to disagree, and then he looked at her face and whatever he saw there settled the question. He went to get the mules. The storm came at 2 in the afternoon. It did not build it arrive the way a wall arrives when you walk into it in the dark. One moment the sky was pale and the air was mild, and the prairie looked the way it always looked, and the next moment the horizon to the northwest had gone black, and the temperature began dropping, and the wind came in a single sustained scream across the open ground, with nothing between it and the cabin to break its speed or reduce its intent. The temperature inside the cabin registered 34 degrees above zero when the storm front hit. Within the first hour, it was 22. Owen fed the stove continuously, pushing cottonwood in every 20 minutes, watching the temperature on the cabin wall thermometer. The way you watch a water level during a flood, the number itself less important than its direction of travel. 12 degrees above, 9 above, 2 above, 0, 6 below. The numbers kept moving in the wrong direction with the mechanical indifference of a thing that cannot be argued with. The wind was the constant, not gusting, not variable, but steady and immense, a force pressing against the cabin walls, the way water presses against a dam, looking for the weakness that would eventually be there. The sod roof held. The banked earth on the north wall held. The chinking that Marta and Owen had packed into the log joints in November, let through occasional thin cold drafts that they stuffed with rags as they found them, the two of them moving through the cabin in a deliberate rotation, checking walls, checking the stovepipe joint at the ceiling, checking the base of the door, where cold air sought the lowest point of entry, 18 degrees below zero by nightfall. The mules stood in the far corner of the cabin with the stoic resignation of animals that have decided that the strangeness of their circumstances is preferable to the alternative. The water in the pots and buckets had not frozen the stove. Heat held the cabin above the critical threshold, barely consuming wood at a rate that Marta calculated against the woodpile outside and did not share with Owen because the calculation was not useful to share. 24 below, 27 below. At some point in the middle of the night, the thermometer on the cabin wall read 31 below zero, a fall of 65 degrees in 7 hours, and the wind was still screaming across the prairie, and the snow was driving horizontally with such force that the sound of it against the window was indistinguishable from the sound of sand. Owen sat beside the stove, with his knees pulled up, adding wood with the mechanical regularity of someone who had decided that the act of feeding the fire was the only thing currently within his control and was therefore going to execute it with complete attention. Around midnight, he asked how long a storm could last. Marta was sitting across the cabin with her back against the east wall, and she did not answer immediately. She was thinking about the cellar, thinking about 15 feet of earth in a double-layer sod roof and 2 ventilation pipes that were sealed tight against whatever was happening above them. Thinking about the chamber temperature at 38 degrees and the potatoes firm in their bins and the difference between what was happening outside and what was happening below. The storm could reach down through 3 feet of earth. It could reach down through 4 through 5. She had seen it. She had lived its consequences. But 15 feet, I don't know how long it will last, she said finally, but the cellar will outlast it. Owen looked at the cabin wall where the wind was testing the chinking with a persistence that made the sound of it nearly continuous. How do you know? Marta looked at the stove rather than at him. Because the storm doesn't know the cellar is there. It can only reach what it can touch. 15 feet of earth in a 1,000-pound roof, the storm can't touch it. She paused. My brother died because my father trusted a hole that the cold could reach. I did not build a hole the cold can reach. Owen was quiet for a long time after that. The wind did not quiet. The stove consumed wood at its relentless rate. The temperature outside continued to hold at 31 below zero, with the committed certainty of a winter that has decided to demonstrate what it actually is rather than what people have assumed it to be. The storm lasted 3 days. It did not peak and recede the way some storms peak and recede. It held. It held the temperature, and it held the wind, and it held the snow, driving horizontal across the prairie at a concentration that made the air itself more white than clear. On the second day, Marta and Owen could not see the trapdoor from the cabin window. On the third day, the snow had drifted to the roof line on the north side, and the cabin sat inside a white silence that was in some ways more frightening than the noise of the first day, because the silence meant the cold had settled in and was no longer in transit. The wood held. Barely, and by means of a rationing that brought the cabin temperature down to 48 degrees on the third night, which was cold enough that sleep came in shallow, unreliable increments, and the mules shifted and stamped in their corner with a restlessness that had no outlet. But the wood held, and the walls held, and on the morning of the fourth day, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, in the way that very few silences are absolute, the kind that has weight and texture that presses on the ears after days of continuous noise. Marta stood at the cabin door and pushed it open against the snowdrift that had formed against the outside face and looked at a world that had been rearranged. The snow had drifted 6 feet high on the north and west sides of the cabin. The woodpile was invisible under 4 feet of white. The path to the cellar trap door was gone, entirely buried under a smooth, unbroken surface that gave no indication of what lay underneath. 27 below zero. The sky was pale blue and entirely cloudless. The sun present and bright and contributing nothing to the warmth of the air. Winter skies, particular deception, beautiful and useless. Every surface that had been exposed during the storm carried a crust of hard-packed snow that would not shift without tools. Marta and Owen dug for 2 hours, not toward the woodpile, toward the trapdoor. Marta drove an iron rod into the snow in a grid pattern, probing for the solid resistance of the wooden frame beneath, and when she found it, they dug down with shovels, cutting the snow in blocks the way you cut sod, stacking the blocks to the sides to clear a working space. The snow was dense and heavy from the temperature, not the light powder of ordinary winter storms, and each shovelful weighed more than it should have. The trapdoor frame emerged from the snow like something that had been buried for a season rather than 3 days. The leather hinges had frozen in the closed position, the leather shrunk and rigid in the extreme cold. Owen poured warm water from the kettle he had carried from the cabin, and the water hit the leather and steamed, and the hinges flexed, and the door lifted on the second try. Marta descended first. The ladder rungs were cold under her hands, but not iced. No moisture had gotten in, which meant the seals had held, which meant everything she had built to keep the storm out had kept the storm out. She went down slowly, counting the rungs the way she had counted them in October to check her work, and at the bottom she stood still for a moment and breathed. The air of the chamber received her face like a damp cloth, cool, still carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and the fainter smell of root vegetables undisturbed. Not cold, not the killing cold of the world above, not the thin, desperate warmth of a cabin burning its last reserves of wood, but something steady and middle and permanent, the temperature of the planet's indifference to whatever the surface was doing. She lit the candle she had brought down, tucked inside her coat. The flame burned straight up without wavering. No draft, no air movement, the chamber sealed and calm. She held the thermometer out at arm's length and waited. 37 degrees. The potatoes sat in their bins firm and pale and untouched by anything the storm had done. She lifted one and pressed her thumb against the skin, and the skin did not yield. She pulled a carrot from its straw and bent it slightly, and it resisted with the clean resistance of something that had not begun to lose its water. The cabbages hung from the ceiling joists in the same position they had occupied when she latched the trapdoor 3 days before, motionless, unchanged, utterly indifferent to the 65-degree temperature drop that had happened 15 feet above their heads. Marta sat down on an overturned crate. The candle flame burned straight and patient in the stillness. 37 degrees. She had calculated for this. She had dug for this. She had spent 23 days of her 62-year-old body down in the earth, moving clay bucket by bucket, and she had spent 3 months after that building and finishing and filling and worrying, and she had made a decision in August based on the memory of a 9-year-old boy in a 3-foot cellar and 14 years of carrying a debt to someone who had not lived long enough to see the payment made. The calculation had been correct. The depth had been sufficient. The earth had done what she had trusted it to do. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and cried. Not the crying of relief because the danger was not over. The stores were intact, but winter was not done, and the settlement beyond her property line had 3-foot cellars, and she did not yet know what the storm had cost them. What she felt was something older than relief and less simple, the specific emotion of a person who has been carrying a debt to the dead for 14 years and has just made the first payment toward it. Owen's voice came from the top of the shaft, Marta. His tone told her something before the words did. I can see the Pedersen place from up here. Their cellar door is open. She looked up at the rectangle of pale winter sky at the top of the ladder, 37 degrees in the chamber. Ruth Pedersen's cellar door standing open in 27 below zero air, which meant the cold had gotten in, which meant what the cold always meant when it got into a root cellar in the middle of January. She climbed the ladder toward the light. Owen had walked to the settlement and back in 3 hours, which was twice the ordinary time because the drifts on the road north of the creek had buried the fence lines entirely, and the only way through was to probe with a stick and guess and sometimes be wrong. He came back with snow to his thighs and a face that had gone past cold into the particular blankness that comes when the body has been spending everything it has on staying functional and has nothing left over for expression. He stood inside the cabin door and Marta handed him a cup of something hot without speaking, and he drank half of it before he said anything. Ruth Pedersen's cellar had frozen to the floor. Not partially, not in the lowest bins to the floor. A solid mass of ice and ruined vegetable matter that Ruth had found when she opened the door on the second morning of the storm, desperate for potatoes for her 6 children, and discovered that the 3 feet of earth between her stores and the frost line had not been 3 feet of protection at all. It had been 3 feet of delay. The frost had come through it the way water comes through a cracked dam, not all at once but thoroughly and with the same final result. She had lost everything stored on the floor level. The upper shelves had survived, but the upper shelves held 2 weeks of food for a family of 7, not the 3 months that the floor bins had represented. Walter Den had not survived the storm uninjured. On the second day with his grandchildren crying from hunger, and his own stores already compromised by the earlier cold snap, he had opened his cellar door and gone down the ladder in the middle of the storm to retrieve what remained of his turnips. He had made it down safely, coming back up with the wind screaming across the open trapdoor above him, and his arms full, and the rungs glazed with the ice that had formed the moment warm cellar air met the killing cold outside his left foot, had gone wrong on the 3rd rung from the top, and he had fallen backward into the cellar. His son had found him the next morning when the storm broke, still breathing on the cellar floor with a broken hip and a body temperature that the doctor from the county seat, who arrived 2 days later on a horse that had nearly not made it through the drifts, described as dangerously low without specifying what dangerously meant in practical terms. Walter was alive. Whether he would walk again was a question February had not yet answered. Carl Bergstrom's cellar had held better than most. The man had 9 years of experience, and he had built well and banked generously, and his cellar was among the deepest in the settlement at 4 feet 1 foot more than average, 1 foot less than what the storm had required. The frost had come 4 inches into his potato supply, moving through the packed earth with the slow certainty of something that had all winter to complete its work. He had spent the morning of January 15th sorting through the bins, separating the frozen from the firm, doing the calculation that every settler in Beaver Creek was doing that week, and arriving at the same conclusion: what remained would not last until spring. Owen told Marta all of this while she stood at the stove with her back to him, absorbing the information in the order he delivered it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "They're talking about you," Owen continued, "in the settlement. They're saying you knew. They're saying you dug that cellar because you saw this coming." Marta turned from the stove. "I didn't see anything coming. I remembered something that had already happened. They're saying they want to come see it." She looked at him directly. "Then tell them to come." Carl Bergstrom came the next day. He came alone on foot without announcement, and he came in the middle of the morning when the sun was at its highest and the temperature had climbed to 18 below, which passed for tolerable in the days after the storm. He walked up the path that Marta and Owen had dug out the day before, wide enough for 2 people to pass, with the excavated snow banked on both sides at shoulder height, and he stopped at the trap door and stood looking at it for a moment before he looked at Marta, who was splitting wood nearby with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has decided that every hour of daylight spent not doing something useful is an hour that cannot be recovered. He was carrying his hat in both hands in front of him. He was 63 years old, and he had buried a wife and a son to Dakota winters and had spent 9 years building an authority from those losses. And he stood in the January cold with his hat pressed flat against his chest and said nothing for a long moment. Marta set the splitting maul down against the block and looked at him and waited. This was the scene that had been coming since August, since the day in front of the general store, when he had told her what a widow woman alone could and could not do, and she had no interest in hurrying it or prolonging it. She led him to the trap door without speaking. She watched him go down the ladder with the careful movement of a man favoring his left knee, an injury that was visible now in the way he transferred his weight on each rung, his right leg doing most of the work, his left coming down to meet it rather than leading. 9 years of Dakota winters lived in that knee as surely as they lived in his face. He stood at the bottom of the shaft for a long time. Marta descended after him and stood back against the wall and let him look. He examined the corner post, pressing his palm against the oak, the way she had taught herself to read the walls, checking for give and finding none. He looked at the ventilation pipes and traced the cord to the sliding panel and worked the mechanism open and closed once understanding it. He looked at the potato bins, firm pale, completely unaffected by the storm that had destroyed his own supply, and then he looked at the thermometer. 37 degrees. The same as the morning after the storm. The chamber had barely moved. I told you 3 feet was enough. His voice in the chamber had a different quality than his voice in open air. The clay walls absorbed some of the resonance and left it flatter, more naked. I told you the frost never goes that deep. Marta looked at him steadily. You told me what 9 good years had taught you. That's not the same as telling me what the 10th year would do. He was quiet for a long moment. He turned the thermometer over in his hands without reading it again, just holding it, and when he spoke again, the quality of his voice had changed in a way that was not easy to name. The confidence was still there, but it was resting on different ground that had shifted under him without warning. My potatoes are half ruined. My turnips are gone. My wife is measuring what's left against the weeks until April, and we both know what that calculation says. He set the thermometer back on its nail. My son's wife died last year. He's in the house with 3 children and whatever I can keep them fed with between now and spring. Marta did not look away from him. She thought about Eric, about the specific weight of a 9-year-old boy in her father's arms, about the way her father had stood in the kitchen with that weight and said 4 words that had traveled across 14 years in 2 states to arrive at this cellar 15 feet below the Dakota prairie, where a man who had told her she was digging madness was standing with his hat in his hands. Take what you need, she said. 2 bushels of potatoes, 1 of turnips, no payment. Carl Berstrom looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in any of their previous encounters. Not the settled authority of the man who had told her what a widow woman could not do, not the flat assessment of the man who had done the math and found it lacking, but something more exposed. His mouth worked briefly without producing words, and then, why, because I dug this cellar for survival. She looked at the bins, at the hanging cabbages, at the rays of preserved plums in their row on the southwest shelf. Not only mine. He climbed the ladder slowly, 1 rung at a time, his left knee making its accommodations. At the top, he put his hat back on and stood in the January air and did not speak for a moment. Then, I'll send word to the others. Marta watched him walk back down the path toward the settlement road and disappear around the bend in the creek, and she stood in the cold until he was gone, and then she went back to splitting wood because the wood pile was still short and winter was not finished, and there were things within her control and things outside it, and the ones within her control required her immediate attention. They came throughout the rest of January. Families she knew, families she had met only in passing, one family she had never seen before whose claim was on the far north side of the settlement beyond the creek bend, far enough out that their losses had been total, and their situation was the most urgent she encountered. The father came first alone to see if the stories were accurate. He was a quiet man, lean from a hard winter with the deliberate movement of someone managing a body on insufficient fuel. He stood at the edge of the open trap door and looked down into the cellar, and then looked at Marta with an expression that was very close to disbelief. My children are hungry, he said. Just that. Not asking, not demanding, stating a fact the way a man states a fact when he has run out of the energy required to dress it in anything. Marta pointed at the trapdoor. Take what you need. There's a bin of potatoes on the north wall, carrots in the straw boxes beside it. Take enough to last you 2 weeks and then come back. He went down and filled 2 sacks and came back up and stood for a moment with the sacks in his hands and looked at Marta. He said thank you in a voice that carried more than the words, and she nodded once and went back to the woodpile. Ruth Pedersen came on the third day after Bergstrom's visit in the late afternoon, when the light was going orange and flat across the snow. She was carrying a small jar of honey, the last of what she had put up from a neighbor's hives in September, saved through the worst of the storm, and now being offered because Ruth was not a woman who came to ask for something without bringing something in return, even when what she brought was small against what she was asking. She set the honey on the table without preamble. I told you that you were digging to China. I told you it was madness. She sat down in the chair across from Marta with the solid decisiveness of a woman sitting down to a task she intends to complete. I was wrong. You were right about the risk, Marta said. I almost didn't finish. 3 different times I thought I wouldn't finish. But you did finish. Ruth looked at her with the direct appraisal that was her habitual expression, but there was something underneath it now. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration, the look of someone updating a map of the world based on new information. Half the families in this settlement ate through January because of that hole in your yard. Marta poured 2 cups of weak coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of Ruth. The earth fed them. I only dug down far enough to let it. Ruth took the coffee. Next year I'm digging deeper. 6 feet at minimum, maybe 8. Dig 10, Marta said. Line the walls with timber. Separate your apples from your potatoes. Ruth looked up from the cup. Why the apples? Apples give off a gas that makes potatoes sprout faster, go soft by February instead of March. Old knowledge. Marta sat down with her own cup. My mother taught me. Her mother taught her. The kind of thing that doesn't get written down because people assume everybody knows it, and then one generation doesn't pass it along, and it disappears. Ruth was quiet for a moment. They're calling it the deep vault. You know that. People talk about it that way. The deep vault held, the deep vault saved us. It's what people say when they mean your cellar. Marta said nothing. She looked at the coffee in her cup, which was weak enough that the cup showed through the liquid, and thought about a name that was not hers to argue with. The settlement would call the thing what it wanted to call it. She called it what it was, a cellar dug by a woman who had seen the price of shallow ground and refused to pay it again. I didn't save anyone, she said finally. The earth saved them. I just dug deep enough to let it. Hank Storrow arrived the following week with a wagon and 2 hired men, and he did not come for himself. He came for the families north of the creek whose losses had been total and who had nothing left to trade, nothing left to offer, nothing left at all, except the particular dignity of people who have not yet broken, despite having very good reason to. Storrow was not a sentimental man. Marta had understood this from their first meeting, but he had the practical decency of someone who distinguishes between what the market requires and what the moment requires. And in the second week of January, he had apparently decided that the moment required something the market would not provide. He loaded 6 bushels onto the wagon without discussion, and when Marta said nothing, he looked at her with an expression that acknowledged the silence and worked within it. At the edge of the property, he stopped and turned, not quite facing her. I'll cut the timber for a second cellar in the spring. Your labor, my wood, no charge. Marta looked at him across the distance between them. I'll hold you to that. He drove the wagon north without another word, and the sound of the wheels on the packed snow faded and was gone, and the prairie was quiet. The way it was quiet after weather, completely, with the specific silence of a landscape that has said what it needed to say and is now waiting for the response. The stores held in ways that continued to surprise her. 12 bushels of potatoes had become 8 before the worst of the giving, and 8 had become 5, and 5 should have felt like a threshold, crossed a point of no return. But 5 bushels, it turned out, was what 2 people needed to last from February to April if they were not wasteful, and she and Owen were not wasteful. The carrots were barely depleted. The cabbages had survived the winter better than any other vegetable in the cellar. Better than Marta had dared to hope. Only 2 had shown rot, and both had been caught early enough to contain. 34 of the 37 jars of preserved plums remained. February arrived with a moderation that felt almost apologetic after January's demonstration. The temperature climbed back to single digits above zero, which after 31 below felt nearly mild, and then into the teens, and then on a Tuesday, in the second week of February, the thermometer outside the cabin read 28 above zero, and Marta stood at the cabin door and felt the difference in the air, not warmth, not yet, but the absence of the particular malice that had characterized the air since the 12th of January. The cold was retreating. Not gone, not close to gone, but no longer advancing. She went to the cellar that morning and read 38 degrees and did not cry this time. She sat on the overturned crate and let the steadiness of the chamber settle into her, the way you let a quiet room settle into you after a long time in noise, and she thought about the shape of the thing she had built and what it had done and what it continued to do, simply by existing 15 feet below a prairie that had tried its best to prove the surface uninhabitable. Owen came to her in the second week of February with a question that had been gathering weight for a while. He had written to the land office in Yankton. The claim his father had filed, the quarter section to the east, the one he had stayed in Dakota Territory to preserve, was still viable. The deadline to file officially was April 15th. He had the money for the filing fee saved from the odd jobs he had worked through the fall, and the small amount Marta had paid him from her remaining cash for the heaviest work on the cellar. What he did not have was enough for the first season's seed and tools, the minimum required to demonstrate to the land office that the claim was being actively worked rather than merely held. He laid this out for Marta in the evening, sitting at the table with the lamp between them, and his voice had the careful neutrality of someone presenting a case they are not sure will be received favorably. He was not asking. He was explaining. There was a difference, and he understood it. Marta opened the small tin box she kept in the back of the kitchen shelf, the one that had held $43 in August and had been drawn down by every necessary purchase since. She counted what remained into her palm. $14. Owen saw her do it. Marta took the land to the east. She looked at the money in her hand. How far does it run? Quarter section. Touches your northeast corner at the creek bend. She looked at the $14 and thought about the arithmetic of the next year's spring planting, summer maintenance, fall harvest, the second winter, and all its requirements. $14 was a thin margin for a woman alone on a Dakota claim, with a wood pile that needed rebuilding, and a cabin that needed a better floor, and seeds to buy and tools to replace. She had managed on less. She had arrived with 43 and survived a storm that had broken people with substantially more. She held the money out across the table. I want a good neighbor more than I want $14, she said. A neighbor who knows how to dig. Owen looked at the money and then at her face. He took a breath that was not quite steady. He was 17 years old, and he had worked beside this woman through the worst winter in Dakota Territory's recorded history, and he had learned things in those months that he understood, in the imprecise way of the young, would take him years to fully comprehend. He took the money from her hand with the seriousness of someone accepting something that has real weight, not just monetary weight. I'll dig 12 feet, he said, on the east claim, timber frame, double ventilation. 14 feet, Marta said. You can afford to be cautious. Something in his face, not quite a smile, but the interior equivalent of the thing that happens in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. He folded the bills carefully and put them in his coat pocket, and they sat with the lamp burning between them and the cellar holding steady 38 degrees in the earth below their feet, and neither of them said anything more about it because nothing more needed to be said. Owen filed his claim on April 8th, 7 days before the deadline. He rode to Yankton himself, leaving before dawn to make the round trip in a single day, and came back after dark and with the papers folded inside his coat, and the expression of a man who has completed something that cannot be undone. He showed her the documents at the table under the lamp, the land office seal, his father's original filing number carried forward to his own name, the legal description of the quarter section that ran east from Marta's claim along the creek bend, his name on the papers in the land office clerk's handwriting, and then his own signature beneath it. Carl Bergstrom appeared at the property again in March when the snow had retreated from the south-facing slopes and the creek was beginning to make sounds under its ice that suggested movement below. He came this time with a different posture than January, not hat in hand, not the exposed vulnerability of a man coming to ask for something. He came with Owen, which was the first indication that something had been arranged without Marta's knowledge. Owen had been walking to the settlement twice a week as the snow receded and the roads became passable, maintaining the contacts he had built through the fall and winter. And at some point during those visits, he and Bergstrom had arrived at a conversation that produced a plan. Bergstrom had looked at his own cellar 4 feet everything he had trusted for 9 years, 1 foot deeper than community standard, and 1 foot short of what the winter had required. And he had done what experienced people do when a method fails completely. He had decided to replace the method rather than defend it. He wanted to dig a new cellar. 9 feet, he said, timber framed with ventilation pipes designed after what he had seen in Marta's chamber. He would supply the timber from his own stores. He had enough left from last season's cutting to frame a cellar of that depth properly. What he needed was the knowledge of how to build the ventilation correctly, how to time it, how to achieve the temperature management that had kept Marta's stores intact through 31 below zero. He did not ask her directly. He explained the plan to Owen, and Owen brought the plan to Marta, which was either a courtesy or a calculation on Bergstrom's part, an acknowledgement that asking her directly required a kind of humility that he could deliver through an intermediary more easily than in person. Marta understood this. She was 62 years old and had spent a life among people who found certain admissions difficult, and she had learned that the form of the asking mattered less than whether the thing got done. She told Owen to tell Bergstrom she would explain the ventilation system to whoever was digging, and that she would come to the site once the chamber was framed to verify the pipe placement. She did not charge for this and did not offer to because the knowledge was not hers. It was her mother's and her mother's mothers and whatever series of women before them had understood that earth at depth held steady when nothing else did, and charging for it would have been charging for something she had inherited rather than invented. Bergstrom came himself the following day without intermediary and asked the questions he needed to ask. Marta answered them at the kitchen table with a piece of charcoal and the back of an old envelope drawing the pipe placement and the sliding panel mechanism and writing the temperatures and timing in her small exact handwriting. He took the envelope and looked at it for a long time and then folded it carefully and put it in his coat. He had spent 9 years as the man in Beaver Creek who knew how to survive Dakota winters. He was 63 years old, and he was sitting at a widow woman's table, writing down what she knew. And he did it without any of the ceremony that might have accompanied such a reversal in a less practical person, which was Marta thought perhaps the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. "Your husband," he said before he left, standing at the cabin door. "He started the cellar at 3 feet. He started it at 3 feet, Marta said. He would have gone deeper if the fever had given him more time. He was a practical man." Bergstrom looked at her with the expression of someone deciding whether to say the thing they are thinking. He said it. "You are a practical woman." "I'm a woman who has been trying to solve the same problem since 1873, Marta said. "Eventually you get the answer right." He left, and she listened to his footsteps recede down the path, and she stood in the open doorway with the March air coming in around her, cold still, but with a different quality, the cold of a season ending rather than a season at its height. And she let herself think about April, which she had not allowed herself to think about since August, because thinking about April had felt like a luxury she could not afford until the winter had made up its mind. He would begin breaking sod on the east claim in May. He would dig his cellar before he broke ground for a cabin. Marta had been clear on this, and he had not argued. He would dig 14 feet, frame it with the timber Hank Storrow had committed to cutting, and install a ventilation system built from the drawing Marta gave him, which was a copy of the one she had given Bergstrom, but annotated further with the lessons of the winter. Just past the timing adjustments, she had made the modification to the north pipe after she noticed the southeast corner running 2 degrees warmer than the rest of the chamber. By the following fall, 11 families in and around the settlement had dug to 8 feet or more. The depths varied according to resources and ambition, but the principle was uniform. The same principle Marta had tested against the worst winter Dakota Territory had produced in living memory and found sufficient. The earth holds steady where the air does not. That was the whole of it. Everything else was engineering in service of that fact. Marta spent the spring planting the field that Thomas had broken in May of 1887, following the furrows he had cut and extending them with the mule and plow through June. She planted potatoes and turnips and carrots and cabbage more than the previous year, because she had more cleared ground, and because she intended to put up stores enough to give away without reducing her own margin to nothing. She planted wild plum slips from the creek bank along the south edge of the field, knowing they were unlikely to produce for 2 or 3 years, but planting them anyway because she intended to be there in 2 or 3 years to see what they did. The apple trees she had ordered through Storo's lumber operation arrived in May, 5 bare-root whips of a variety recommended for northern climates packed in damp burlap for the journey from a nursery in Illinois. She planted them along the creek bank in a spot that got morning sun and afternoon shade and had good drainage from the slight slope. The soil was not ideal, too much clay, not enough loam, and the nurseryman's letter said the trees would struggle for the first 2 or 3 years. She planted them anyway. The letter also said they would bear fruit in 5 years if they established well. She was 62. She intended to eat those apples. Owen began breaking sod on the east claim in the second week of May, and on a Saturday in late May, Marta walked the fence line to the property corner and stood watching him work from a distance. He was running the mule in long, straight lines across the grass, the plow turning the prairie over in dark ribbons, and he worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had decided that the land required his full attention and was giving it. He had grown through the winter, not just taller, though he was taller, but in the way that mattered more, the way that comes from having been tested and found sufficient. He was still 17. He would turn 18 in July. He would break this ground and dig this cellar and build this cabin and file this farm, and he would do it correctly because he had learned from someone who had learned the hard way what correctly meant. He saw her at the fence line and lifted a hand, and she lifted hers in return, and that was the whole of it. No ceremony, no conversation required. She walked back to her own field and picked up her hoe. Bergstrom's new cellar went 9 feet deep and came in at 40 degrees after the first week of ventilation cycling. He came to tell her this in October, stopping by the property on his way to the settlement, and he said it the way he said most things without preamble, as a fact. 40 degrees, same as yours. Marta looked up from the row she was turning. Did you separate the apple store from the potatoes? A brief pause. He had not thought of the apples. She could see the calculation moving across his face, the rapid inventory of what he had already stored and what could still be reorganized. I'll move them this afternoon. She went back to the row. He went back to the road. That was the whole of it. Owen Farley married a woman named Clara from a farm in the next county in 1892. Clara was practical and steady and had the kind of humor that arrives quietly and lands accurately, and she and Marta developed the particular friendship of two women who respect each other's competence without requiring the friendship to be otherwise explained. Owen finished his cabin in the spring of 1891, the cellar already 2 years old and proven through 2 full winters, and they married the following year when the cabin had a proper floor and 2 rooms and a porch that faced south toward the creek. Their first child was a daughter born in the late winter of 1893, and Owen brought the baby to Marta on a Sunday afternoon in March when the snow was still deep, but the light had changed the particular shift of late winter light that announces spring without delivering it yet. He placed the child in Marta's arms without any particular speech, and the baby looked up at Marta with the ancient, unfocused attention of the very new, and Owen said the name they had chosen, Marta. She looked at him over the baby's head. He had been 17 when she met him, 18 when the storm came, not yet 20, when he filed his claim and signed his name to the future. He was 22 now with a farm and a wife and a daughter, and he looked at her with the steady eyes that had been his from the beginning, the eyes that had not looked away when she told him about Eric, that had read the depth of the cellar and concluded that depth was the right answer. That's the name of the person who taught me that hope is not a plan, he said. Marta held the baby and said nothing for a while because some things do not need a response, and this was one of them. She lived on the claim for 11 more years after the blizzard of 1888. She improved the cabin incrementally, a better floor, a second window, a covered porch on the south side where she could sit in the evenings and watch the light go off the prairie in the long summer sunsets. The apple trees took 3 years to establish and then grew with the stubborn determination of things that have decided to survive despite unfavorable conditions. And in 1893, she ate the first apple from the largest tree, small and tart and imperfect and entirely real. She died in the winter of 1899 in her sleep in the cabin she had roofed with canvas and determination 12 years before. Owen found her in the morning, The ground was frozen too deep to dig, which was the way of things in Dakota winters, and they kept her in the cellar until April, 15 feet down, 38 degrees, the frost held back by the same depth and the same engineering that had held back everything the territory had thrown at it since the autumn of 1887. It was, everyone agreed later, exactly where she would have wanted to wait. The trapdoor in the yard remained for decades after the cabin was gone. The cabin itself came down eventually, a later owner, a generation removed from the blizzard of 1888, who found the cottonwood logs too far gone to repair and built a new structure 20 yards to the east. But the trapdoor stayed because the cellar beneath it was structurally sound and practically useful, and because there was something about the thing that made people reluctant to close it off permanently. The ladder was replaced twice. The ventilation pipes were relined once. The walls, built from the dense, dark silt clay that started at 9 feet below the surface, held their shape without significant settling for 40 years and were still holding when the next generation made their own accounting of what the earth had preserved. Farmers who had come to the territory after 1888 and had heard the story secondhand would sometimes stop at the trap door and look down into the darkness and feel the cool air rising from below, that particular cool, that mineral stillness, that meant depth and steadiness, and they would think about the winter. They had missed the winter that the older settlers spoke about, with the specific economy of people describing something that had cost them something real. They would think about the woman who had dug this while everyone told her she was wrong, and they would get back in their wagons and drive home, and some of them, when they built or rebuilt their own cellars, would go 1 or 2 feet deeper than they had originally planned, just in case. Owen Farley's daughter grew up on the claim east of the original homestead, within sight of the trapdoor in the neighboring yard. She knew the story the way children know the stories that belong to their particular place, not as history, but as landscape, the way a bend in a creek is known, or a hill with a particular profile against the sky. She knew that her name meant something, that it had been chosen to carry something forward that the person who bore it first could not carry any further. When she was old enough to ask directly, she asked her father what the woman had been like. Owen was quiet for a moment, in the way he was sometimes quiet when a question reached past the ordinary surface of things. Then, she was the kind of person who remembered what it cost to be wrong and spent the rest of her life making sure the cost was paid in full. The earth holds steady where the air does not. Marta Lund did not invent this. She did not discover it. She only remembered it at a cost she had not chosen and dug down far enough to put it to use. That was the whole of the thing. That was all it had ever been. A woman who had seen the price of a shallow hole and refused, with the full weight of 62 years and 14 years of carrying a debt to a dead boy, to pay that price again. The prairie kept her cellar long after it had forgotten her name. And the people who came after, who had not been there and could not fully imagine it, built their own cellars a little deeper than they had to, because the story had traveled and the story had weight, and some things pass between people across time, the way knowledge passes between those who understand that what is not written down is not necessarily lost. You just have to remember to dig deep enough to find it.